In this episode, we'll be covering 15 games released between June and August of 1985. There'll be a number of unfamiliar titles this week. Most of this week's releases are Japanese-only titles, and they're mostly arcade ports. Remember, of course, that at this point, the vast majority of the non-Nintendo release games for the Famicom were ports either of arcade games or of Japanese computer games. However, we will be seeing two games that appear to be Famicom originals, Hon Shogi and Geimos. We'll also see the Japanese debut of one of Nintendo's more infamous accessories, the Robotic Operating Buddy. Welcome to the first game of this episode. It's Hyper Olympic by Konami. This is the port of the 1983 arcade game, which you might know as Track and Field. One thing that's a little unusual is that this game apparently uses licensed music. If you notice, the music playing here is the famous Olympic theme by John Williams. I assume that Konami had to pay to use that in this game. Now, unlike Air Kung Fu or Antarctic Adventure, this game was well known in both the US and Japan and was a pretty substantial arcade hit. So I think getting this title on the Famicom was probably a bit more prestigious for Nintendo than those first two Konami titles. Now, if you played this game in the arcades, you'll probably remember this being the game that you sort of had to pound on the buttons with your hands furiously in order to get your players to run fast. I imagine this caused quite a bit of stress on machines, and as I recall, one of the machines in a local arcade had installed sort of little rings around the buttons so you couldn't actually pound on them quite so hard. Of course, this made the actual game more difficult to play. Now for the Famicom version, because there's only two buttons on the controller, you only actually use one button to run. The second button is used for jumping and that sort of thing. Now the Famicom port looks pretty similar to the arcade version. The graphics aren't quite as good. However, there is a pretty substantial difference in that the original arcade version had 6 games, whereas the Famicom release only has 4. Those would be the 100-meter dash, the hurdles, the long jump, and the javelin. The running games on this involve mostly just sort of hitting the button to get your player to run really fast. The other games, such as the javelin or the long jump, involve running and then jumping and holding down on your D-pad until your player reaches a certain angle. Much of the challenge of the game for these events is sort of getting your player at the right angle. And then occasionally there is these little interludes here where the players just sort of run around the Olympic theme. You don't actually do anything yourself during these, they're just like little cutscenes. There are these weird little hidden bonuses throughout the game. For example, on the 100-meter dash, if you finish with the exact same time as your opponent, this little teddy bear thing appears and you get a bunch of bonus points. Each of the events have their own little hidden bonus. Now for the American release, this was released under the name Track and Field. And Track and Field actually has 8 events, not just 4. What actually happened is, this game was not released in the US until 1987. At that point, there had already been a sequel in Japan called Hyper Sports, so they actually took both Hyper Olympic and Hyper Sports and combined them into one game, Track and Field. So the US version has the extra 4 sports, which are skeet shooting, pole vaulting, triple jump, and archery. The American version's actually a bit easier than the Japanese version because you can actually select which sport you want to play. In the Japanese Hyper Olympic, you actually have to qualify for an event before you can move on to the next one. And here we have Star Force. This is a port of Tekken's 1985 arcade game, also known as Megaforce. As you can see, this game is a vertical shooter. Now, Star Force was actually developed by Tekken themselves, a company that would later change its name to Temco. This game was actually published by Hudson Soft, however. We'll take a look at the original arcade version. As you can see, the Famicom actually does a pretty good job of replicating the arcade graphics. The game also plays and feels quite a bit like the arcade version. We'll go back now to the Famicom. At the time this game was released, Temco was not yet a Famicom licensee, so they couldn't release this game themselves. So apparently they actually went with Hudson Soft to actually release this game. Now, Temco is one of those companies that's been around in some capacity for quite a while, but didn't actually start developing video games until around 1981. Of course, they're still around today. They're behind such games as Ninja Gaiden and the Dead or Alive series. So Star Force falls very much into the school of post-Xevious shoot-'em-ups. The game is pretty simple. You really only have one weapon, some sort of laser cannon. Not too much long way of power-ups here. There actually is a way you can make your ship more powerful. We'll actually see that right here. But there really aren't any of those special weapons power-ups like you would normally expect to have of later shooters, no mega bombs or anything like that. Back in 1984, shooters didn't really have much of those kind of things. However, there is something sort of like an end-of-level boss. At the end of each level, you actually have to destroy a target, even though it's not really difficult. So as far as old-school shoot-'em-ups go, yeah, I'd say Star Force is a pretty good game. Once you've dealt with this boss-like creature, you'll move on to the next level, and then it sort of repeats forever. Or so I would assume when you actually played the game all the way through. As usual, you get more difficult enemies in later levels. For example, these little things shoot all kinds of crazy bullets at you. So the game controls pretty well. It's reasonably fun, fast-paced, certainly a lot better than the two shooters that Jalico released earlier in the year. I've heard this game was actually pretty successful in Japan, not so much in the US, even though it was actually released in the US. A lot of these early Famicom games weren't. We'll take a look at the US version in just a second. You know, it's interesting, this game actually does get relatively hectic for a shooter of this early vintage, much more so than, say, Xevious. Xevious was much more sedate. Of course, this game is not actually as good as Xevious, but it just does play quite a bit different. We'll look at the American version here. The graphics actually are a little different. A few things have been changed, apparently. Nothing too major, however. So I guess we'll say, as far as old-school shoot-'em-ups go, Star Force is actually a pretty decent game. Next up, we have Elevator Action, a port of Taito's 1983 arcade game. Unlike a lot of these early Taito ports, this one was released in the USA as well as Japan. As you can hear, this game contains a great old-school style soundtrack. Not too much of a plot here. Basically, you play this sort of red-headed, pompadoured super spy. Your job is to steal some plans and then get to the bottom of the hotel and escape. Along the way, you'll face countless Boris Badenov-style foreign agents which you're permitted to shoot on sight. You can also shut off the lights to make the room darker, making it a little harder for you to get hit. Plans are actually found behind those red doors. You'll want to collect all those in order to get a good score. Notice that the floors are numbered. This sort of gives you a general idea about how far along you're getting towards the bottom. Now this game came along at a time when video games were sort of getting away from the single screen type of game, games such as Pac-Man for example. Scrolling was becoming a lot more common. I think the idea behind games like Elevator Action is that the game takes place in a larger world beyond what you can just see on a single screen. You can only see a bit of this world at a time, however the more of the game you complete, the more you'll encounter. Nowadays, of course, this idea is very common. However, back in the early 80s, scrolling was still relatively new, so it made games like Elevator Action seem sort of interesting and different. Elevator Action was one of those early games that sort of drew you into a larger world. The fact that the action was so simple and repetitive really made it all that more appealing. Even though the rules were simple, there were still a number of things that could happen in the game. Now, as I mentioned, once you get to the bottom, to the basement actually, you jump in your little sports car, zoom away, and then the game begins again. Of course, the next building is a little bit different. And that's Elevator Action in a nutshell. Now, since Elevator Action came out in 1983 in the arcades, the graphics are pretty simple, so the Famicom is able to pretty much accurately represent the graphics in this game. Next up, we have Field Combat by Delico. This is a port of Delico's 1985 arcade game. Now, oddly, this Famicom version actually looks an awful lot like the original arcade release. There hasn't really been much of a graphical downgrade from the arcade version. This is a little strange. I mean, the arcade version looks like it came out more like in 1982 rather than 1985. If you think about it, 1985 was the year that games like Ghosts and Goblins were coming out, which, looked about 10 times better than games like this. Now, this game might be described as a vertical shooter, but it's not really. It's actually more of a commando type game. There's no forced scrolling, the enemies don't just whiz by you, don't shoot them, and everything's at a much slower pace than most shooters. Something that's a bizarre little coincidence is the prototype for all these kind of games, which was called Frontline, will actually be released for the Famicom very shortly after this game. Now, there are several ways that Field Combat differs from your typical run-and-gun type game. One of them is levels are actually quite short. It has a number of short levels rather than several larger levels. The object is to get to the very top, knock out the big guns guarding it, and then go through the gate. Once you've done that, you'll go on to the next level, or the next pattern, as this game calls them for some reason. Now, the really novel thing about Field Combat is they've taken a concept from Galaga and pretty much turned it on its head. Rather than your enemies having a tractor beam they can use to suck up your ship, you are equipped yourself with a tractor beam that you can use to suck up enemy units. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see that it actually shows you which units you have in reserve. These are enemies that you've captured. You can call as many of these as you like into combat by hitting both buttons at once. If you lost all your reserve units, you can then get more by using your tractor beam to suck up the enemies. Now, occasionally a UFO will come along, and as you can see, he will spirit away the friendly units that you have on the screen. So these unique features, such as the ability to capture enemy units and then use them against the enemies, is something that sort of separates this from the other games in the genre. This game certainly is actually pretty fun to play, at least for a little while. And it's certainly not nearly as bad as Frontline, which we'll be seeing very soon. And this is Konami's Road Fighter. This is actually the first of two top-down racing games that will both be released in July. About a week later, Zippy Race would come out. I guess they weren't afraid of flooding the market with top-down racing games. Now for some reason, when you start the game, you can hold down the acceleration button all you want, but your car accelerates much slower than all the other cars. Now we call this a racing game, but the idea really isn't to cross the finish line before other cars, or even to cross the finish line before the timer, but rather to cross the finish line without running out of gas. If you look down towards the right, you'll see a fuel gauge. This is constantly going down. In fact, it lowers even when you're not moving. For example, if you crash, you lose some fuel, and then it continues to go down even while you're still sitting there. So I guess the fuel gauge basically is a timer after all. Keep an eye out there for Konami Man flying across the screen. Yes, this game was the first appearance of Konami Man. He flies by occasionally at random. You get extra points if you manage to stay alive while he crosses the screen. Didn't happen to me, unfortunately. The multicolored cars that you see are actually fuel cars. You'll want to collide with those while avoiding all other vehicles. Once you finish this race, you'll move on to the next level. There's 4 levels altogether. After the 4th level, the game simply repeats infinitely. Now one thing that's a little different about this game is it's not one of those games where if you get hit by a car you'll automatically explode or run off the road. In fact, if you do get hit, you can actually recover by pressing the D-pad in the direction that you're swerving. Just like real life, you can turn the wheel and recover from a swerve. The exception are the trucks. You'll explode automatically if you hit those. Now on this level, for example, the roads are so narrow that you really have almost no room to recover from being hit by a car. There's so little space that it almost sort of knocks you directly off the side of the road. Once you hit the side of the road, your car will crash and you'll lose some fuel. You'll see this here in just a second. Once you get all the way through all 4 levels, as I mentioned earlier, the game will simply repeat. One thing you might be thinking about this game is it looks an awful lot like Spy Hunter. And unfortunately it does sort of play like Spy Hunter as well, but without the various guns and weapons and power-ups and that sort of thing. In fact, I think the first time I played this game, when I saw one of the trucks, I thought, oh well, I'll go ahead and line myself up behind the truck and go inside and get a power-up, but no, it doesn't work the way the trucks are just regular cars. Another obstacle are the oil patches that will send you sort of careening off in one direction. So yes, this is not really a bad game. It's reasonably enjoyable for what it is. It plays kind of like a dumbed down version of Spy Hunter, unfortunately, but it's certainly not as bad as Zippy Race, which we'll be seeing in a few moments here. This game is Taito's Warpman, a port of their 1981 arcade game. Originally this game was known under the titles Warp and Warp and just plain Warp Warp. Why the name change? Well, we'll discuss that in just a moment. Now if you take a look at the original arcade game, you might think, hey, this looks an awful lot like a goofier version of Berserk. Well, basically it is, but there is a difference, however. The game starts off with you just running around shooting guys. However, if you enter the warp zone in the middle, while it's flashing, you will suddenly enter the second screen. In the second screen, you run around blowing up guys with little bombs. Well, hey, that's an awful lot like Bomberman, isn't it? It's quite possible that Bomberman was based on Warp Warp, or it could just be a coincidence. Now this version of the game for the Famicom, Warpman, has been graphically retooled, as you can see. The basic gameplay is still the same. You start off running around shooting guys. When the galaxy starts flashing, you enter into it, go into the second zone, and then you run around planting bombs. You can actually see the galaxy flashing here now. However, you only have a few seconds to step into it before it stops. There's a few other changes that have been made to this game. Some additional enemies have been added. You can actually now get upgrades to your weapon. There's a blaster you can get that'll make your gun more dangerous, and there's upgrades to bombs you can get as well. Despite these minor differences, it's primarily the same game. Now, I don't know that anyone was screaming for an NES port of this particular old arcade game. I assume that the release for the Famicom had something to do with the new popularity of Bomberman on Japanese computers. Warp and Warp actually beat the Famicom Bomberman to the shelves by a few months. Bomberman would be released for Famicom in the near future. Maybe Taito was just trying to sort of re-establish their claim to being the first ones to create a game of this nature. Additionally, the new title kind of indicates the need to compete with Bomberman as well. You just saw the bomb upgrade there, but the level ended before I could grab it. So while there's nothing really wrong with this game, it is unfortunately sort of destined to remain a historical curiosity rather than a playable game like Bomberman. Our next game here is Zippy Race, a port of Irem's 1983 arcade game. This is actually the first Irem release for the Famicom. This game was also known as Moto Race USA or Traverse USA. Now either of those games is more appropriate because this game certainly is not very zippy. In fact, this game seems less like a cross-country race and more like being stuck in traffic behind a bunch of little old ladies on a Sunday drive. The cars in this game are actually pretty aggressive. As you can see here, they really don't want to let you get around them. What this means is when you need to pass a car, you'll have to slow down and sort of very carefully make your way around them to avoid getting hit. Now on the right-hand side of the screen there, you'll see a fuel gauge. Your fuel supply is constantly decreasing, but of course there are occasionally extra fuel pickups you can get. Unfortunately, they're pretty far and few between, and they're placed in such a way that if you don't know where one is, you'll probably miss it by driving right by. And to make matters worse, your fuel isn't replenished at the end of each level. All these factors sort of conspire to make Zippy Race a less than fun game. Now, one thing about this game that's a little unusual is that once you get to a certain point near the end of the race, the perspective will suddenly change from an overhead view to a behind-the-vehicle view. If anything, this new perspective makes getting around vehicles even more difficult. Luckily, this section of the race is pretty short. You're only riding for a few more minutes here before suddenly you reach your destination. In this case, we're driving from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. The next round will have you racing towards Houston. The objective, of course, is to drive all the way across the entire country. It's actually a bit of a shame. I mean, the idea of a cross-country race on motorcycles is actually pretty interesting. I mean, this game is, the whole concept sounds a bit more fun than the other racing games released on the Famicom at this point. It's really too bad this wasn't better realized. Now, as I mentioned, this is the first game published by Irem for the Famicom. They did the arcade version of Kung Fu, but Nintendo actually released that title themselves. Irem originally stood for International Rental Electronic Machines. Sometime in the late 70s, they decided to start making arcade games. Most of their early games were sort of, typical product of the era. Space Invaders ripoffs, that sort of thing. Probably their first really good, successful game was Kung Fu, or Spartan X, it was known in Japan. It came out in 1984. Irem eventually sort of specialized in shooters and beat-em-ups. Probably the most well-known series by Irem is R-Type, starting with the 1987 arcade game of that name. Irem continued to release arcade games until the mid-90s, and of course, they also continued to make games for home consoles such as the Famicom. This rather cute little opening scene and music here belongs to Door. Now, Door is notable for a couple reasons. First of all, it's the first title published by Enix. Secondly, it was actually an enormous success in Japan. This game then paved the way to a number of later huge hits from Enix, such as Dragon Quest. The object of this game is to capture all the monsters that appear on each screen. You do this by luring them towards an open door. If they're headed in the right direction, they'll walk into it. You can then shut it behind them. Each door has a little black handle on it. You can only open the door if the handle is facing the right way. As you can see, a lot of these doors have two handles, so you can open them either way. A lot of later levels have only doors with one handle on them. Oh yes, and if you touch one of the little bombs, you'll explode. The little pieces of candy are good for bonus points. Now the monsters have to enter the door going the right direction. For example, I've opened this door to the right. The monster has to walk into the door to the right. If he's coming the wrong direction, he'll just walk on past it. Once the monster's inside, you need to close the door. The doors can only be opened and closed each way once. Later levels actually contain more monsters than doors. This means you'll have to trap several monsters at once. Otherwise, you'll run out of open doors before you run out of monsters. These sort of games, like Flappy or Door, really seem to resonate with Japanese audiences at the time. These games were mostly strategy-based, not skill-based. Door doesn't really require fast reflexes, so much as the ability to think a level through and be able to plan your course of action. I'm not sure why these games were so popular. Maybe the Famicom was introducing video games to an audience that hadn't really played them so much before. After all, the Famicom was being marketed in Japan as a family computer, that is, something for the whole family. So how does this game actually play? Well, it's certainly a well-designed game, that's for sure. The levels are well thought out, the characters are original and cute. The protagonist has a bit of personality to him. Notice the way he sort of taps his foot impatiently when he's not moving. I guess this is the first video game character, with attitude, sort of like Sonic in later years. Now, one thing you might not like about the game is the pace. Your character doesn't exactly haul ass across the screen. In fact, he moves quite slowly, especially when going up or down ladders. Playing this game, you really wish there was some way to sort of speed him up a bit. And then there's the matter of the general structure of the game. Like a lot of games of this era, for example Flappy or Wrecking Crew, you basically have one level. Once you complete it, you go on to the next level, which is usually sort of similar, and then you sort of repeat until infinity. This game technically has 50 levels. Once you get to the last one, then the whole thing starts repeating. The levels get consecutively harder, but they don't really change that much throughout the game. This may irritate modern gamers who are used to more variety in their games. Of course, at the time it was standard, so this really shouldn't be held against Door. Now this type of game, the single screen but many different levels, will disappear pretty quickly on the Famicom. By the way, this game is not a Famicom original, it's actually a port of a game that was released slightly earlier by Enix for Japanese computers. And I should also point out this game was developed by Koichi Nakamura. He and his Chunsoft development team would later go on to such games for Enix such as Dragon Quest. This is Super Arabian by Sunsoft. This is the first Sunsoft game for the Famicom. And this is an advanced port of an arcade game from 1983 called Arabian. However, I believe the original arcade game was actually published by Sun Electronics. Sunsoft is like a special home console video game division that had not yet been created in 1983. Now, Sunsoft eventually became known for making some pretty good games for the Famicom, for example Master Blaster. However, Super Arabian is definitely not a good game. Quite frankly, playing Super Arabian, I'm really reminded of playing like an old Atari 2600 game. The gameplay is very simple, just sort of running and jumping. The graphics are very bland. There's really not much to recommend this game to anybody. Now, the game starts off harmlessly enough. The first screen is no big deal. However, once you get to the second level, you start encountering a few gameplay problems. Why is it so hard to jump and grab hold of a vine, for example? Now, by the time you get to the third screen, all bets are off. I think there are 7 levels for this game altogether, but I've never been able to get past the third one. If anyone out there actually has played this game all the way through, you have a lot more patience than I do. By the way, if you collect the letters in the correct order and spell the word, you'll get like a bonus. For example, the second level you have to spell horse. Now coming up here we have the very ugly and very difficult level number 3. Something that's a little odd is notice that when he jumps he actually has a sword in his hand. If this guy is armed with a sword, why does he keep attacking his foes by kicking them? All these little crows and things look kind of like little pink worms are coming after him, and he'll only kick them for some reason. Now at this point in the game, Super Arabian becomes a platformer of the most annoying and unplayable variety. I tried this for a little while but lost patience. It seems impossible to actually jump on little flying carpets without falling right through them at times. This level in particular seems very, very poorly designed and thought out. Note that there is a second difficulty level on this game. You have to collect the letters in a certain order and you actually can't see them until you grab them. This doesn't really make the game any more fun, however. So this is definitely not a promising start for Sunsoft. Later they would come up with games with some really great graphics, but man, this is definitely not one of them. If you combine the ugly graphics, the poor controls, the bad hit detection, and the general unplayability of this game, you actually have one of the worst games to come out for the Famicom so far. Now here we have Stack Up, or as it's actually called on the title screen, Robot Block. The first thing you might notice is that Nintendo actually got a bit creative with the menus on this game. For the first time they really seem to be sort of trying to put a unique menu as opposed to sort of the standard template of the logo and then the options below. Now Stack Up is the first of 2 games released to be used in conjunction with the ROB, the Robotic Operating Buddy. This was basically a toy robot that plugged into your Nintendo and allowed you to play some games with it. This particular game required the use of these stackable colored discs. The other ROB game, Gyromite, required little spinning gyroscope type deals. Now unfortunately this video can't really show the actual gameplay of Stack Up. That would require a video of the actual robot itself. What you see on the NES screen is really only part of the game. But what it actually involves is giving commands to ROB to move the little blocks from one stack to another. There's several different gameplay variations. Like in the first one, you enter commands one at a time, then the robot moves them. In the next gameplay variation, you actually enter in all the commands, and then once you're done, then the robot will carry out the commands. Furthermore, there's something called Bingo, which is available for both 1 or 2 players. The main problem with this game is it's not really much of a game. It's almost more of an interactive toy rather than anything else. I suspect that people that purchased the version of the NES that had Rob in it were perhaps a little disappointed when they actually got this home and started playing with it. But I don't really think that was quite the idea behind Drop. I think it was really more of something to entice young people to buying the deluxe NES set, rather than anything else. I think the main purpose of ROB was to make the NES in the United States look less like a video game console and more like some sort of interactive toy system. As a result, ROB became probably the most infamous of the various accessories Nintendo released for the NES that were released with much fanfare and then not really supported that much. I suspect that most people who purchased ROB back in the day probably fooled around with it for a little bit and then went on to play more interesting games on the Nintendo. Nintendo's main strength was, after all, making great video games, not making gimmicky things such as ROB. Released a mere 3 weeks after Field Combat, we have Frontline. Keep an eye out for this part right here where the demonstration mode shows you actually winning a level, because you'll probably never see that while you're playing the game in real life. It's hard to imagine anyone actually having the patience to play this thing all the way through to the end of a level. Now when you put this game on, probably the first thing you'll notice is the really appalling graphics. Look at the way your character runs. And then of course there's the incredibly annoying repetitive music. Yes, this game was released by Taito, but it's certainly not the best thing they've ever done. In fact, this game is a terrible, horrible, unplayable mess. However, it's also historically important because this was one of the very first of these vertical run-and-gun type games. These games generally have you playing some sort of unstoppable super soldier battling an entire army worth of foes. The arcade game originally came out in 1982 and it didn't really look any better than this. The graphics were pretty awful. Now I'm not 100% sure, but I think the arcade version may have had a rotary control. This would have made the game very similar to the later Ikari Warriors. A rotary controller would certainly make the game a lot easier to play. One of the problems is simply how difficult it is to actually control your character. Use the D-pad to both move and to aim. You can shoot in 8 directions, but it's very easy to sort of shoot in the wrong direction or to move in the wrong direction. So you have to move your character in the direction you want to shoot your gun in. This exact same problem would plague the NES release of Ikari Warriors, which is also not a very good game, at least for the Nintendo. This game is interesting if just for historical reasons. It sort of set the rules for this entire genre. For example, you have the tanks that you can jump into. If the tank gets hit, you have to jump out before it explodes. A lot of these elements were used in later, much better games. It's really a shame this game is so awful. Looking at this video, it doesn't really look that bad, but if you actually sit down and try to play it for real, you'll probably really start hating it. I guess this game scores points for realism. A lot of games like Commando make war seem like a lot of fun. This game definitely doesn't. Maybe that was the whole idea behind the game, I don't know. So unfortunately, while this is an interesting game, we're going to have to put Frontline in the same category as Famicom games such as Formation Z, games which are virtually unplayable. This game is Tower of Druaga by Namco, a part of their 1984 arcade game. Now, of all the games we'll be seeing in this episode, Tower of Druaga is certainly the most interesting. First of all, note that it actually has a detailed plot described in the introduction. If you read through this, you'll see that with its kidnapped princesses, golden armor, crystal rods, etc., this game introduces a lot of themes and plot points that will be used in later fantasy games. In fact, this is the first fantasy-themed game for the Famicom, and the arcade version is one of the very first fantasy games ever in Japan. Now, the object of the game is to scale the tower floor by floor until you reach the 60th floor, where you battle Druaga. There's certainly nothing original about this plot. In fact, it's basically the same as the old computer RPG game Wizardry. However, the execution of the game places it squarely in the tradition of arcade games like Pac-Man. The maze is given in a top-down view, while the characters are given in a side or frontal view. The characters are in sort of a foreshortened perspective, which would later become standard in Japanese RPGs. You advance from floor to floor by collecting the gold key, then killing any monsters in your way and advancing to the exit. You then repeat until you reach the 60th floor. Now, if all this sounds rather dull and repetitive, well, yes, it definitely is. But what makes this game interesting and different is that every level contains a hidden item. A certain action must be performed in order for a treasure chest to appear. Collecting the treasure chest will then give you an object. On early floors, the requirements are actually usually something pretty simple, such as killing a certain number of monsters. However, as you go higher up in the tower, the requirements become much less obvious. In fact, the game seems to take a certain sadistic pleasure in making the requirements unusual and slightly arbitrary. For example, in later levels you might have to touch a certain wall, or even do something strange like hit the select button on your controller. Some treasures, such as the shoes found on level 2, are very helpful. The shoes will increase your speed, for example. Others, such as the various swords and shields you'll collect later in the game, actually don't do anything by themselves. However, they are necessary to getting better treasures later in the game. While this game doesn't seem like much, it was enormously popular and enormously influential in Japan. For example, Nintendo would take this basic concept, improve on it vastly, and release it as The Legend of Zelda. Additionally, the concept of finding various sorts of useful objects and power-ups became quite ubiquitous in console video games in the near future. Obviously, Japanese RPGs made extensive use of this idea, but also platformers and action games like Castlevania, Metroid, etc., etc. Even Mario can power up by collecting mushrooms. And something else that's very interesting is that this game transfers the player's interest from the ostensible goal of defeating the wizard to that of uncovering all the game's secrets. Tower of Druaga introduced gamers to the mindset of fetishistically collecting hard-to-find objects in video games. This idea carried over into all genres, not just Japanese RPGs, but even straight-ahead action games like the Grand Theft Auto series. Rather than playing games just for pleasure or trying to get a high score, the object was now to complete the game by finding every secret or hidden item. Now oddly, this game was a pretty big success in Japanese arcades. However, this idea for a video game really seems much more suited to consoles rather than arcade games. In fact, more than any other game released on the Famicom so far, Tower of Druaga really points towards the future of console gaming. Now, this game was not released in the United States, but in Japan, the Tower of Druaga franchise is actually considered to be one of Namco's more famous series. This really sort of underscores some of the differences between Western and Asian gamers. Japanese gamers really seem to sort of have the patience to sort of grind their way through a long and repetitive game in order to get some kind of ultimate reward at the end. And there are a lot of things that make this game not very enjoyable to play. It really doesn't seem to play fair with you. For example, in the later levels, a lot of wizards will be able to cast spells across the room. They often seem to materialize right next to you and suddenly zap you. I don't know how many times I was suddenly zapped by a wizard right as I was entering the door to exit the room. Additionally, Gilgamesh takes an excruciatingly long time to sheathe and unsheathe his sword. So if you were to sit down and actually try to play this game through from beginning to end, I can't say you'd probably have a very enjoyable time. Still, its influence on the Japanese gaming culture was huge and undeniable. Even the character's name, Gilgamesh, looks forward to the Japanese RPG tradition of taking names and places from various world, mythology, and religions and sort of inserting them willy-nilly into a fantasy setting. The basic combat mechanic, using a sword and a shield and killing monsters by running into them, was reused in Zelda a few months in the near future. And of course, Japanese RPGs such as Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest owe a huge debt to this game. So even though this game is not actually very fun, its influences can be felt pretty much everywhere in the gaming world, right on down to the present day. Now this rather unusual little game is known as Astro Robo Sasa, published by ASCII. In this game you play a very small little robot, or perhaps a guy wearing some kind of armored suit, with an unusually large gun. I'm not sure what he's trying to compensate for, but this gun has so much kickback you can actually use it to shoot yourself around the screen. Firing it down will allow you to fly up in the air, defying the laws of gravity, and then you can fire it from side to side in order to get you around the screen. The object is to collect those energy tanks. One thing you don't want to do is to accidentally have an energy tank drop to the ground. Now you have an energy counter. You'll see that at the top of the screen. Every time you fire a shot, you lose 1 unit of energy. Hitting an enemy will cause you to lose more. You can replenish energy by collecting one of the energy tanks. Now you don't have any lives in this game, you simply play until you run out of energy and then it's game over. So the object is more or less to collect the energy tanks while losing as little energy as possible, therefore firing off as few shots as possible and not getting hit by the enemies. Altogether there's around 16 levels to this. They start off at in a field and then move on to like some sort of Air Force base or something. Eventually you go into a warehouse, an undersea sequence, and finally into outer space, which I guess is why they call this Astro Robo Sasa. And this game is actually a little difficult. One thing about it is your energy tanks do not replenish between each level, which means that basically for each level you have to collect more energy than you use. This means playing very carefully, starting at the very beginning level. If you do not collect enough energy in the early levels, you won't have enough to actually complete the game. This game was published by ASCII, which was a well-known Japanese computer company. Since the late 70s, they were publishing a rather popular Japanese computer magazine and were a manufacturer of hardware and software. They were one of the companies that helped create the MSX computer standard, and sometime in the early 80s they started publishing computer games for the MSX and eventually the Famicom. This particular game was developed by a rather obscure company called Mass Tale Limited, but I really don't know anything about them. For better or worse, the success of the Famicom is going to see a lot of untried companies attempting to throw their hat into the video game ring. Now this game is called Hon Shogi, Naito Kuden Shogi Hidden, which apparently translates something along the lines of original Shogi, Naito 9-Step Secret Shogi, or something along those lines. And this is by a company called Sata. As you can see, they actually have their little logo plastered right there on the screen for the entire game. The name Sata stands for Super Entertainment and Total Amusement, and unlike a lot of the other companies that were developing games for the Famicom, they were actually a very new company founded in 1985. This is one of their first, or possibly even their very first title. They did a number of titles for the NES as well as arcade games, and they really seem to sort of specialize in things like this, as well as pachinko machines and that sort of thing. I'm pretty sure they're still around. Now, like Mahjong and Go, Shogi is a Japanese game. It's actually considered to be sort of the Japanese chess. You're playing against an actual computer here. He has sort of electronic claws for arms. Each player takes turns moving a piece. The pieces up front are the infantry. There's other pieces as well, various sorts of generals, horses, chariots, that kind of thing. The object of the game is to capture the main general. Now if you're thinking, wait a second, this game is obviously just chess, this is just a rip-off of chess, what were they thinking? Well, that's not exactly quite true. Rather, chess and shogi are actually descended from the same ancestor game. This ancestor game, Chaturanga, originated in ancient India, Eventually it spread west and became chess, and spread east and became games like shogi. Of course, the actual rules and moves are, somewhat different than European chess. And the game is a bit difficult for Westerners because it uses Japanese characters on the pieces rather than individual shapes, the way we do it in Western chess. I really can't say if this game is any good at playing shogi or not. I don't play the game myself, but it certainly is kind of cute with its little robot opponent. I suppose if you're a shogi player, you might want to try this. This is definitely has a little place in history as being the first shogi game for the NES. Many more would follow. This game was surprisingly not released in the United States, as is the case with most of the shogi games for the Famicom. Once we're done listening to that great little opening musical theme there, you'll see that we're playing Gyromite, or Robot Gyro as it's called in Japan. Actually, the title screen here says Robot Gyro. That's because the US cartridges were basically exactly the same as the Japanese cartridges. Gyromite is the second and last game to use Rob, the robotic operating buddy, for the Famicom. In this game, Rob is set up to pick up and drop two spinning gyroscope-like discs that rest on a blue and red pedal. What this will do is open and shut the blue and red columns that you see in the game. In this game, you're chased around by little lizard creatures. However, you can cause them to temporarily stop by dropping a turnip in front of them. They will then eat the turnip and you can make a getaway. The actual object of the game is to collect all the pieces of dynamite hidden throughout an individual level. You are once again playing Professor Hector. Each level is usually a few screens in size. And you use these little green ropes to go up and down. And that's pretty much all there is to this game. The main appeal to this game, or rather the main challenge, is using the ROB to actually open and close the red and blue pillars. Once you've completed a level, you'll go on to the next level, which is slightly more difficult. This game is actually similar to a lot of games on the Famicom, such as Wrecking Crew, for example. One of the cool things in this game is you can actually squish little lizards by closing a pillar down upon him. Now this game isn't really that great, but before we judge it, or ROB too severely, remember that ROB was not really intended as something that Nintendo was going to support. As far as I know, it was mostly intended to be sort of a marketing gimmick for the NES in the United States. I really don't think that Nintendo had great plans for ROB and then just sort of forgot about them. Rather, I think they needed a little something extra that they could use to help sell the NES to American consumers. And of course also to electronics retailers as well. They really wanted to make the NES look less like a video game system and more like some kind of new and unusual toy. The fact that the NES contained a robot and a zapper gun inside really made it stand out from other systems like the Atari 2600, for example. Once consumers were hooked on the NES, there was really no need for such gimmicks such as Rob any longer. And here we have Geimos by ASCII, credited to the rather obscure Wixel Corporation. We'll discuss them in just a second. Now, one thing that is unusual about this game is that as far as I can tell, it's actually an original for the Famicom. And as you may have noticed, there haven't really been very many of those so far not published by Nintendo. In fact, the only other two games that were not ports of something else for the Famicom before this were a Mahjong game and the Shogi game we saw just a second ago. Every other item has been either a port of an arcade game or a computer game. Unfortunately, if this is the way that Famicom original is going to look, then that's probably not really a good thing, because this game is actually quite terrible. As you can see, it's certainly very unpleasant to look at. It's one of these pseudo 3D shooters. There were a few of these around at the time, like Xurian was another example. This one is maybe even worse than Xurian, it's really hard to say. One thing about these games is the graphics are so limited. This game actually came out around the same time as Space Harrier. If you look at Space Harrier here, you see that, wow, it's got gigantic sprites. It actually takes up the entire screen. By comparison, this game has very limited playing space, and the little creatures don't really get that much bigger as they come to you. I mean, certainly if you had this game at home and you went to the arcade and played Space Harrier, you'd probably be sorely disappointed. It does actually have I guess, a decent-sized boss here. And quite frankly, some of the graphics in the background really aren't that bad. Look later, you'll see a gigantic planet in the background, so parts of it look kind of cool, but it's still not a very good game. Now about this Wixel company that actually developed the game, well, no one really seems to know much about them, but apparently some people think they actually might somehow be connected to the infamous Micronix development company. Micronix was sort of known for making some of the very worst games on the NES, and fortunately we will encounter them a few times. Beyond that, there's really not too much to say about this game. Compared to contemporary arcade games like Space Harrier, this really shows off the limitations of the NES hardware. The Super Famicom would end up being much better at this sort of thing. This was really not the Famicom's speciality. And this is also an early example of a small independent development company releasing a game for the Famicom that's really not very good. We'll actually unfortunately be seeing quite a lot of this in the future.